Hello, my favorite people, my little people, my big people. River's here. You know me. You love me, in spite of myself. Sometimes I make you laugh. Sometimes I make you cry. That's me, in a nutshell. Little dramatic, little over the top, but I think I'm a keeper. Okay, well, let's get rid of all this crap and move on to a story. Like I was telling you, all trips have some really cool aspects to them, and things go wrong and you have to kind of roll with the punches. And this was a trip, I think it might have been back, it was before Brad was married, and he was back off his mission, and I had a CLE back in New York City, I believe. This is before Emily and Ty had met, and I lived back there. And I'd been back to New York City a fair amount of times. I find it still to be a completely exciting and fascinating place, but no offense to Ty and Emily, wouldn't want to live there. But I have a lot of fun when I go back. So when I was a kid, I wanted to be, when I was really little, I think it was from watching too many Tonight shows with Johnny Carson, I wanted to be a stand-up comic, shoot for the stars, right? And then I wanted to be a comedy writer for a sitcom, another shoot for the stars. Well, my mom was a big fan of Johnny Carson, and she became, later after Johnny Carson, became a huge fan of David Letterman, and she passed her love of David Letterman on to me. I liked Letterman's humor, and he had a show that was called Late Night with David Letterman. And so I had this CLE, and somehow things kind of worked out. And I believe it was back in September of the year as fall, early fall. And early fall in New York City can be just absolutely gorgeous, and that's what this case was. So anyway, I had this wild notion, and I said, Brad, why don't you come back with me? And we'll go to this conference together, and we'll see some of the sights of New York City. And he was game, and I thought, I want to see the David Letterman show. And so at the end of each show, Late Night with David Letterman, they would have a telephone number, or maybe it was, I don't know, some way to contact him and see if you could end up going to a show, and you had to answer a David Letterman trivia question. Well, I was going to ace that because I was really up on David Letterman. And so I procured 2 tickets to David Letterman, and I think it started at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the Ed Sullivan Theater. And I had never been to a live show before, a television show, and I was pretty excited. And like I said, I was a huge Letterman fan. And so Brad and I were waiting in line. We got the tickets, and we came in, and Letterman used to joke that the Ed Sullivan Theater was like 38 degrees, that you could see your breath. And it was pretty chill, but it was a kind of a warm day, and so it was very inviting to sit in this relatively small studio and watch David Letterman. And it was all fascinating. And I was having a wonderful time back in New York City with Brad. And lo and behold, guess who? The musical number. I felt like I'd been blessed, that this was a sign from heaven. The musical guest that night was none other than Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. I am a huge Beach Boy fan. I've been a Beach Boy fan since I was 7 or 8 or 9. I had a really good friend, Jeff Hawker, who had older siblings, and they were into the Beach Boys. And so I became a really big fan, and I'd watched his career and, kind of how it progressed and gone up and down. And Wilson had suffered from some mental illness and probably some drug use and alcohol use, but he's a survivor. And I've read a couple of books about his life, and I just love his voice, and his voice and his music's very evocative of the time that I grew up. But anyway, he was the featured musical guest. And at that time, he was also kind of under this spell of this kind of healer guy. And Brian Wilson looked like he was a robot that night. They kept having the camera would pose on him and show him, and he was just kind of looked like a deer in the headlight. And he gave his musical number, and I'd nudged Brad, and I just thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the guest that evening was Elizabeth Hurley, who is a British actress, and she's a nice looking woman. And as David Letterman would say, she's easy on the eyes. And may I tell you that my wife is easy on the eyes, to steal a phrase. So anyway, we just had this wonderful show. We laughed, and Paul Schaefer and his orchestra, and it was really, really fun. And as we shuffled off out of the Ed Sullivan Theater, Brad said to me, as only Brad can, "I'm hungry." And so at about 10:30, 11 o'clock, in a perfect New York City early fall evening, we found a really nice little restaurant with tables out on the sidewalk. And we had a delightful dinner, and Brad and I had the best time. But I got to see one of my comedy favorites, David Letterman, and then Brian Wilson, for heaven's sakes. So life is good. And I just love all of these opportunities that I have to travel with my children, who I just love and adore. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.